The laughter was the worst part. Not the words. Adese Whitmore had been quietly preparing herself for some version of those words for approximately 8 months, in the way that perceptive people prepare for things they hope will not happen but understand probably will. She had filed them away in the back of her mind like a document she kept meaning to delete and never quite did. The words, when they finally came, landed with the dull familiarity of something already half known. But the laughter, that she had not prepared for. Brennan laughed the way men laugh when they have decided the person in front of them no longer requires consideration. Loose and careless, chin tilted up slightly, as though the whole situation were mildly entertaining rather than the deliberate dismantling of 9 years. He was leaning against the kitchen counter in the house they had bought together. In the kitchen she had painted herself over a long October weekend 3 years ago, and he was laughing at her with the particular ease of someone who had already emotionally vacated the premises and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "I'm replacing you, Adese," he had said, and then laughed, as though the verb were funny. As though she were a subscription service he was upgrading. She was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway with her coat still on and her work bag still on her shoulder because she had walked in 40 seconds ago and had not yet had time to put anything down. She had worked 11 hours. She had stopped at the market on the way home. There were groceries in the bag on her shoulder, among them the specific brand of coffee Brennan preferred, which she had remembered to buy despite the 11 hours and the exhaustion, because she always remembered. She thought about the coffee. She did not cry. She set her bag down very carefully on the hallway floor, straightened up, and looked at the man she had married at 26 with the focused attention of someone determining, in real time, how much of the past 9 years had been genuine and how much had been a story she was telling herself. The answer arrived quickly and was not kind. "Who?" she said. One word. Flat and clean. He told her. A name she vaguely recognized from his office. Younger, which she had expected, and uncomplicated, which she understood was the actual appeal. Brennan had always found her complicated. Had said it fondly at first, then neutrally, then with a faint but unmistakable edge, as though complication were a character flaw she could correct if she cared enough to try. She had spent considerable energy trying. "You're not even going to fight for this," he said, and she could not tell if it was a question or a disappointment or simply an observation. There was something in his expression that wanted her to crumble, not from cruelty exactly, but from the particular vanity of people who need their leaving to feel like a loss. "No," she said simply. "I'm not." She picked up her bag. She walked to the guest room. She closed the door with a quietness that was its own kind of statement, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her coat with the market bag in her lap, and she breathed, deliberately, methodically, the way she had learned to breathe through difficult things, and she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of feeling everything before she began the practical work of figuring out what came next. What came next, as it happened, was nothing she could have planned for. Nothing she could have imagined in the guest room of the house she had painted and furnished and filled with the careful, unacknowledged labor of someone who had loved a person more attentively than that person had ever noticed. What came next walked into her life 3 days later wearing centuries like a second skin, with eyes the color of deep winter and the bearing of something that had outlasted empires. And it knelt at her feet. Have you ever had a moment where someone's cruelty revealed not your weakness but your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Adese Whitmore had never been the kind of woman who took up space apologetically. She had learned this about herself gradually, the way you learn most true things, not in a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulation of smaller observations over time. She was the daughter of Ngozi and Bernard Whitmore, a nurse and a secondary school history teacher respectively, both of whom had raised her in a narrow terraced house in Peckham with the specific combination of high expectations and unconditional warmth that produces people who know their own value without needing to announce it. She was 35 years old. She had a postgraduate degree in architectural conservation and a position at a mid-sized firm in the city where she spent her days determining how to preserve old things without freezing them in time, how to honor what something had been while allowing it to become what it still could be. She had always found the work quietly meaningful in a way she had difficulty explaining to people who had not stood inside a 300-year-old building and felt it breathe. Brennan had stopped asking about her work approximately 4 years into their marriage. She had noticed. She had filed it alongside the other things she noticed and did not yet know what to do with. His increasing absences, the way conversations about the future had gradually shortened and then stopped, the particular quality of his attention when they were in rooms with other people, scanning, assessing, looking for something she apparently was not providing. She had loved him honestly. That was the part that sat heaviest in the guest room on that first night. Not the betrayal itself, but the honesty of her own investment in contrast to his. 9 years of genuine attention and remembered coffee preferences and October weekends painting kitchen walls. And he had looked at all of it and found it replaceable. She did not think she was without fault. She was, by her own assessment, occasionally too self-contained, too capable of processing things internally rather than broadcasting them, which people sometimes mistook for indifference when it was actually the opposite. She had inherited this from her father, who felt things enormously and expressed them precisely, which was not the same as frequently. But she was not the reason this marriage had failed. She understood that clearly by the second morning. The person who helped her understand it was her closest friend, Ottoline Ferris. Ottie, who had known Adiz since their postgraduate program, and who arrived at the house on the second day with 2 containers of jollof rice, a bottle of good wine, and the specific energy of someone who had been waiting patiently for permission to say several things. Ottie was small and copper-haired and relentlessly perceptive, the kind of person who noticed the thing beneath the thing and had the courage to name it without making you feel exposed for having felt it. She sat across from Adiz at the kitchen table. Adiz had returned to the kitchen deliberately because she refused to cede that room, and she poured the wine and she said, "How are you actually?" Not a question, an invitation. Embarrassed, Adiz said honestly, which is interesting because I haven't done anything embarrassing. He has. Shame travels in the wrong direction sometimes, Ottie said. I keep thinking about the coffee. Ottie looked at her. Adiz explained, the market bag, the specific brand, the 11-hour day, the automatic remembering. Ottie listened without interrupting, which was one of her most valuable qualities. You were paying attention to someone who had stopped paying attention to you, Ottie said when she finished. That's not a character flaw. That's just where you were. Where I was is apparently replaceable. Where you were, Ottie said carefully, is not who you are. Adiz looked at her wine glass for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the street was doing its ordinary evening things. A neighbor walking a dog, a delivery bicycle, the amber of the streetlights coming on in the early dark. He laughed, she said. That's the part one keep returning to. Ottie's expression shifted into something quiet and serious. I know. What kind of person laughs at that? The kind, Ottie said, who never deserved the coffee. Have you ever had a moment where someone's cruelty revealed not your weakness but your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. The project arrived on a Thursday. Adiz had returned to work on the Wednesday. 2 days after the kitchen conversation, for days after Brennan's laughter had rearranged the architecture of her life. Because sitting in the guest room of her own house while Brennan moved through it with the breezy efficiency of someone who had already mentally relocated was a specific kind of unbearable that work, at least, offered an alternative to. Her colleague Desmond had looked at her face when she walked in and said nothing except "coffee's fresh" and pointed at the machine, which was precisely the right response and one she filed away with gratitude. She had spent Wednesday on a Victorian terrace restoration in Islington. Familiar work, methodical and absorbing, the kind that required enough attention to crowd out everything else. She had measured and documented and written 3 pages of assessment notes and driven home feeling, if not better, then at least temporarily located in herself. Thursday brought something different. Her firm's director, a measured woman named Philippa Voss who communicated primarily in understatement, called Adiz into her office at 10 in the morning and slid a project brief across the desk with the expression of someone offering something significant and aware of it. Harrowmere, Philippa said. Adiz looked at the brief. Then she looked up. Harrowmere Castle, she said. In the Wye Valley. The estate has been in private ownership for 4 centuries, Philippa said. The current owner has requested an external conservation assessment for the first time in the property's recorded history. Specifically an assessment of the East Wing, which has apparently sustained significant structural deterioration and has been sealed for. She consulted her notes. 80 years. 80 years, Adiz repeated. The owner is particular, Philippa said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words deliberately. He has specific requirements regarding the assessment team. He has requested a single senior conservationist rather than a full team. Discretion, minimal disruption. And he was, apparently, quite specific about requesting someone with your publication record on pre-industrial stone construction. Adi sat with this for a moment. A sealed wing. For centuries of private ownership. An owner who had read her publications. When does the assessment begin? She asked. Monday, Philippa said. You'd stay on the estate. There's a guest cottage. The assessment is expected to take 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what you find. 2 to 3 weeks away from the house with Brennan's absence filling every room like weather. 2 to 3 weeks doing the work she was best at, in a building that had been waiting 80 years for someone to look at it properly. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. She arrived at Harrowmere on a gray Monday morning with 2 cases of equipment, 3 weeks of clothing, and the specific focused calm of someone who had decided that forward motion was its own form of recovery. The estate was extraordinary. She had seen the photographs in the brief, but photographs, she had learned in 13 years of conservation work, were essentially lies of omission. They showed you what a building looked like without telling you what it felt like. And what Harrowmere felt like was immense and alive in the way of things that have absorbed centuries of weather and witness and are now simply patient. The main structure was 14th century at its core, with additions from at least 4 subsequent periods visible in the stonework. She could read them the way other people read faces, the different eras showing in the variation of mortar color and stone cut and architectural intention. It sat in a fold of the valley with woodland on 3 sides and the river visible at the eastern edge, and the gray morning light fell across it with the quality of something that had always been going to fall exactly that way. She was standing in the gravel drive looking up at the east wing, visibly different from the main structure, its windows dark and its stonework bearing the particular weariness of long neglect, when she became aware that she was no longer alone. He had made no sound. She did not know how long he had been standing there. He was tall and very still, with white hair and pale skin and eyes the color of deep winter water, and he looked at her with an expression of complete and unhurried attention that was so different from anything she had encountered recently that it took her a full 3 seconds to remember to speak. Mr. Aldrich, she said. Adiz Whitmore, he said. Not a greeting exactly. More like a recognition. You've read my work, she said. Thoroughly, he replied. You understand that buildings remember. Most conservationists treat them as objects. You treat them as witnesses. She looked at him for a moment. Shall we begin? She said. Have you ever had a moment where someone's cruelty revealed not your weakness but your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. His full name was Silvano Aldrich. He offered this on the first morning as they walked the perimeter of the East Wing together, with the brief economy of someone who considered names functional rather than social. He did not offer a title, a profession, or the kind of biographical scaffolding that people typically construct in first conversations to help strangers locate them in the world. He simply said Silvano Aldrich and then continued walking, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving over the stonework with an attention that Adiz recognized immediately because it mirrored her own. He knew the building. That was the first thing she noticed. Not his appearance, though his appearance was difficult to overlook, but the quality of his familiarity with Harrowmere. He moved through the estate with the ease of someone who had learned a space not from blueprints, but from living, the way you learn the specific creak of a particular floorboard or the draft that comes from a certain window at a certain time of year. He knew which sections of the outer wall had been repointed in the 19th century and which were original 14th century mortar. He knew that the East Wing's foundation shifted slightly in wet weather and that the shift was measurable at the northeast corner specifically. How long have you owned the estate? She asked on that first morning. A pause that was slightly too long for the simplicity of the question. Long enough, he said, to feel responsible for what I have not maintained. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the East Wing's upper story with an expression she was beginning to identify as his version of regret, contained and precise, nothing performed about it. Why seal it? She asked. 80 years is a significant decision. It was, he agreed. It felt, at the time, easier than facing what was inside it. She waited for elaboration. None came. She filed the answer carefully and moved on to her measurements. The work itself was absorbing in the way she had needed it to be. The East Wing's structural issues were significant, but not irreparable. She established this within the first 2 days with a thoroughness that she could feel settling something in Silvano's expression each time she reported her findings. The foundation issue was manageable. The roof timbers in the northern section required replacement, but the southern section was sound. The stonework had suffered from water ingress at 3 specific points that had then been left unaddressed for decades, creating damage that radiated outward from each entry point like the rings of a slow impact. She documented everything. She photographed and measured and sketched and wrote her assessment notes in the evenings in the small cottage that sat at the estate's edge, with a wood fire going and the sound of the river at the eastern boundary faint but present, and she found that the work was filling her in a way she had not realized she had been emptied. Silvano joined her assessments each morning without being asked and departed each afternoon without explanation. He carried no phone that she observed. He asked questions that were specific and informed, about lime mortar composition, about the interaction between different stone types, about the ethics of restoration versus conservation, the line between preserving what something was and imposing what you wished it had been. There's always tension between those two impulses, she told him on the 4th day, standing inside the East Wing's ground floor for the first time, in a large room that smelled of old stone and cold air, and something else she could not identify. Something that reminded her, oddly, of very old libraries. The temptation is to restore to an idealized version that may never have existed. The honest work is to preserve what actually is, even when what actually is has been damaged. He was quiet for a moment. Even when the damage was preventable, he said. Especially then, she said. Preventable damage is still real damage. You work with what's true, not what should have been. He looked at her then, fully, directly, with the complete attention she had noticed from the first morning, and something in his expression shifted into a register she had not yet seen from him. It was not romantic, not yet, but it was deeply personal in a way that felt significant. You apply that principle beyond buildings, he said. Most principles worth having, she replied, apply beyond their original context. It was Haromir's housekeeper, a compact and efficient woman named Wren Colley, who first said aloud what Adiz had been carefully not thinking. Wren had worked at the estate for. She was vague about this in a way that Adiz was beginning to recognize as a local habit, some considerable time, and she managed Haromir with the quiet authority of someone who considered the building her primary responsibility and its owner a secondary, but valued concern. She brought Adiz lunch on the 5th day and stayed to drink tea with the ease of someone who had decided they were going to be friends and was simply waiting for the other party to catch up. He hasn't shown anyone the East Wing, Wren said, wrapping both hands around her mug. In all the time I've been here. He mentioned it had been sealed, Adiz said carefully. Sealed and grieved over, Wren said. There's a difference between closing something off and forgetting it. He never forgot it. She looked at Adiz with the frank assessment of someone who had earned the right to her opinions. He reads your papers, you know. Has done for years. Had them printed and everything. Proper printed copies in the library. Adiz set down her tea. Years, she said. Several, Wren confirmed, with the mild satisfaction of someone delivering information they know will land meaningfully. He said you were the only conservationist writing honestly about what buildings carry, not just what they're made of. Adiz looked out the cottage window at the East Wing's dark silhouette against the gray valley sky and felt something she had not felt in a considerable time, the particular warmth of being seen by someone who had been paying attention. Have you ever found that doing the work you love most brought unexpected light into your darkest season? Tell us about it in the comments. The East Wing sealed room was on the 2nd floor. Adiz had known it was there from the 3rd day. The floor plan she had been provided showed a corridor that terminated illogically, ending 6 feet before it should have met the exterior wall, which meant a room behind a room, accessed by a door that had been plastered over at some point and painted the same color as the surrounding wall, so that if you did not know to look you would not see it. She knew to look. She brought it to Silvano on the 6th morning, showing him the discrepancy between the floor plan and her measurements with the straightforward manner of someone presenting evidence rather than making an accusation. He looked at her diagram for a long moment without speaking. I know the room, he said finally. I thought you might. It is not part of the structural assessment, he said. Not harshly, but with a finality that was clearly intended to close the subject. Adiz looked at him steadily. If there is water ingress in the sealed corridor, as the damage pattern suggests, then what is behind that wall may be affecting the structural integrity of the rooms adjacent to it, which makes it very much part of the assessment. The silence that followed had the quality of something being decided. Tomorrow, he said. I will show you tomorrow. He came to the cottage that evening instead. She was at the small table with her notes spread around her, and the fire low and the river audible in the darkness outside, and his knock was so unexpected that she sat still for a moment before answering. He stood in the doorway with the night behind him and the firelight finding the angles of his face, and he looked like what he was, something very old standing at the edge of something ordinary, uncertain of its welcome. May I come in? He said. Asking. Genuinely asking. She stepped back from the door. He sat in the chair across from the fire, and he looked at his hands for a moment. Pale and still, the hands of someone who had learned patience the long way. And then he told her the truth. All of it. He was, he said, what the old records called bloodborne and the modern world had largely decided was metaphor. He had been alive for a very long time. Harrowmere had been his home for 4 of the estate's 4 centuries, acquired when he needed somewhere sufficiently private and sufficiently old to feel habitable. The bloodborne, he used the word simply, without theater, existed in smaller numbers than they once had, scattered and private, maintaining the kind of low visibility that centuries of complicated human history had taught them was necessary for survival. He waited for her response with the careful stillness of someone who had told this truth before and knew the range of possible reactions. Adiz looked at the fire for a moment. The sealed room, she said. Something moved through his expression. My wife, he said quietly. My human wife. She died in that room 112 years ago. I sealed it the same day, and I have not opened it since. The fire shifted. Outside, the river continued its patient business. You loved her, Adiz said. Completely, he said. And I have spent 112 years understanding that love and grief are not the same thing, and that sealing a room does not preserve what was in it. It only preserves the sealing. She heard her own words from 4 days ago come back through his. You work with what's true, not what should have been. That's why you requested my firm, she said slowly. Not just the East Wing. He met her eyes. I have been reading your work for 6 years. You write about buildings as though they are allowed to have survived difficult things and still be worth preserving. He stopped. Reconsidered. I needed to believe that was true of more than buildings. Adiz sat with the full weight of what he had just offered her. The specific vulnerability of someone ancient and guarded choosing, deliberately, and at considerable cost, to be honest. She thought about Brennan's laughter. About 9 years of careful attention flowing in one direction. About what it felt like to be genuinely seen by someone who had been quietly paying attention across 6 years and considerable distance. Tomorrow, she said, we open the room together. If someone showed you their most guarded wound and asked you to help them face it, what would you do? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. The room behind the wall was full of light. Not literal light. The window had been boarded from the outside as part of the ceiling, and the space was as dark as everything else in the sealed corridor until Adiz's torch found it. But the room had been decorated, once, with the specific intention of someone who understood that light could be built into a space even in its absence. Pale walls, mirrors positioned to amplify whatever came through the window, furniture upholstered in cream and soft gold. A room designed by someone who wanted brightness as a daily, deliberate choice. There was a writing desk against the far wall. A chair still pulled slightly out from it, as though its occupant had just stood up. A small bookshelf with books whose spines had faded to illegibility. And on the desk, placed with the careful deliberateness of something meant to be found, a single journal with a worn green cover. Silvano stopped in the doorway. Adiz did not enter immediately either. She stood beside him and let the room exist in front of them for a moment without rushing toward it, the way she had learned to do with spaces that carried significant histories. You did not barge into a room like this. You announced yourself to it. You waited to see if it would receive you. Then she heard his breathing change. Not dramatically, just a slight alteration in its rhythm, a tightening that he controlled immediately and thoroughly, the reflexive composure of someone for whom composure had become structural. But she heard it. Take your time, she said quietly. I have had 112 years, he said. His voice was steady. The steadiness cost him something. That's not the same as time, she said. He looked at her sideways. Then he stepped into the room. She worked while he sat. This was a decision she made instinctively, giving him the privacy of her apparent occupation, moving through the room with her torch and her notebook and her professional attention while he sat in the chair beside the desk with the green journal in his hands, not yet open, simply held. She measured and noted and assessed the water ingress she had predicted from the damage pattern below, which was present but less severe than she had feared, and she allowed the silence to be inhabited rather than filled. After a considerable time, he said, "Her name was Celia." Adiz wrote something in her notebook that was not about the room. "She was a botanist," he continued. "She came to the valley to document riverside plant species and ended up staying. She found Harrowmere, found me, and she was not frightened." A pause. She was curious. She asked questions the way you ask questions, as though the answers were things she genuinely wanted rather than things she was entitled to. "What happened to her?" Adiz asked, quietly, receiving rather than extracting. "She was human," he said simply. "Time happened to her, the way it does. And I was not graceful about it. I had known it would happen, and I loved her anyway, and when it did I discovered that knowing and accepting are entirely different countries." He opened the journal. Adiz watched him read for a moment. The particular quality of his stillness as his eyes moved across the pages, the way he turned each one with the care of someone handling something that could not be replaced, and she felt, unexpectedly and inconveniently, something shift in the region of her chest. She returned to her notebook. The call from Brennan came that afternoon. She had stepped outside to record the exterior damage at the boarded window, and her phone had rung with the specific intrusion of something that belonged to a different world entirely. She almost didn't answer. Then she did, from the mild self-discipline of someone who believed in completing things cleanly. His voice was different from the kitchen, less certain. He had apparently expected, in the 10 days since she had driven to Harrowmere, some kind of response from her, pursuit or collapse or the particular desperation that would have confirmed his assessment of her replaceability. And her simple absence had apparently unsettled him in ways he had not predicted. "We should talk," he said. "We are talking," she said. "I mean properly. I may have been hasty in how I said things." She looked up at the boarded window of Celia's room and thought about a man who had sealed a room for 112 years because he did not know how to face what was inside it, and another man who was calling her 10 days later because her absence had made him briefly reconsider his convenience. "Brennan," she said carefully. "You laughed." Silence on the line. "That is not hastiness," she said. "That is information. And I received it." She ended the call and stood in the gray valley air for a moment, the river audible at the eastern boundary, the old stones of Harrowmere solid behind her, and she realized with a clarity that arrived quietly rather than dramatically that she was not heartbroken. She was, improbably and genuinely, relieved. What she was not prepared for was what happened when she went back inside. Ren met her in the corridor with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone managing alarming information. Behind her, audible from the direction of the main entrance, were voices, multiple, formal, and carrying the specific register of people who considered their arrival self-evidently important. "Who?" Adiz began. "The Bloodborne Council," Ren said quietly. "They came without invitation. They have been looking for Mr. Aldrich. There are matters, apparently, of succession, and they have brought someone with them." A pause. "A woman. They are calling her his intended." The corridor felt suddenly smaller. "His intended," Adiz said. "Arranged," Ren said, with the careful precision of someone distinguishing between two very different things. "Not chosen. If someone showed you their most guarded wound and asked you to help them face it, what would you do? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments." The Bloodborne Council occupied Harrowmere's main hall like weather. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman, all carrying the particular quality of significant age worn as authority, dressed with the kind of deliberate formality that announced itself as power before anyone had spoken a word. They had arranged themselves in the hall with the unconscious precision of people accustomed to making rooms feel smaller, and the effect was considerable even in a space as large as Harrowmere's entrance. Adiz walked in because Ren looked at her with the specific expression of someone who needed another person to walk in, and because standing in the corridor feeling small was not something she was willing to do. The council's apparent spokesperson was a tall man with iron-gray hair, and the bearing of someone who had been important for a very long time, and found it exhausting in a way he considered beneath acknowledgement. His name, she would learn later, was Counselor Peregrine Voss, no relation to her director, or perhaps some very distant and complicated relation, which felt, in the context of the evening, entirely plausible. The woman they had brought stood slightly apart from the council members with the composed stillness of someone who had been told what this trip was about and had formed her own private opinions regarding it. She was blood-born, pale, precise, with dark hair and watchful gray eyes. And her name was Isadora Thorne. She was, by any observable measure, exactly what a blood-born council would select for an emperor's consort. Ancient lineage, political utility, personal composure. She also looked, Adiz noticed, deeply and privately unhappy about being here. Silvano arrived from the East Wing 2 minutes after Adiz, and the room changed when he entered it. She had seen him move through Harrowmere with the ease of someone at home, had seen him focused and thoughtful, and in one unguarded moment genuinely undone. But she had not yet seen him as what he actually was, in the full political sense, and the council's presence apparently required it. He became, between one step and the next, the vampire emperor. Not through any dramatic shift in appearance, but through a quality of presence that simply expanded to fill the available space, and then somewhat beyond it. A gravitational thing, ancient and entirely real, the kind of authority that is not performed because it does not need to be. The council, despite having arrived with the energy of people delivering instructions, visibly recalibrated. Peregrine Voss spoke first. The situation, he explained with practiced efficiency, had reached a point requiring resolution. The question of imperial succession had been tabled for too long. The arrangement with the Thorne family was, by council agreement, both politically necessary and personally suitable. The time for the emperor's private considerations to take precedence over his responsibilities to the bloodborne community had, respectfully, passed. Silvano listened to all of this without expression. Then he looked at Isadora Thorne directly. "Is this your wish?" Something shifted in her composed face. Surprise, Adiz thought, at being asked. "It is my family's arrangement," she said carefully. "That is not the same answer." "No," Silvano agreed quietly. "It is not." He turned to the council. "You will stay tonight as my guests. We will speak further in the morning. The matter is not resolved in the manner you have assumed." Peregrine's expression tightened. "Silvano." "Your Majesty," Silvano said, with a softness that was the most authoritative thing Adiz had heard in a room full of authority. "In all rooms, Peregrine. We have known each other long enough that I permitted the informality. I am withdrawing that permission." He found her in the East Garden an hour later. She was standing in the cold dark with her coat pulled close and her thoughts arranged in a careful row that kept wanting to fall over, looking at the river's faint gleam at the boundary. She heard him approach. He made sound deliberately when he was coming to her now. She had noticed, an accommodation so considerate it sat in her chest like something warm. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I am your conservationist." Adiz. The way he said her name, fully, precisely, with the specific attention of someone who had learned it because they wanted to rather than needed to, stopped the careful row of thoughts entirely. "The council's arrangement is not something I have agreed to," he said. "It is something they have decided and have been attempting to present as agreed. There is a significant difference." "I know," she said. Wren clarified. "What I have not yet said clearly," he continued, with the particular careful quality of someone who had been practicing honesty as a discipline and was applying it now at considerable personal cost, "is why it matters that you know that." She turned to look at him. In the darkness, his pale face and white hair caught the faint light from the house and the river both, and he looked like what he was, something that had outlasted empires and was standing in a cold garden being genuinely afraid of a single conversation. "Then say it clearly," she said. "In 10 days, he said, "you have walked into the room I sealed for over a century and made it possible for me to sit inside it. You have applied your principle, work with what is true, to every damaged thing you have encountered here, including me. And I find that I am," he stopped, breathed, continued. "I find that I am no longer willing to let political convenience stand in the space where honesty should be." The river moved at the garden's edge. "I am not available for arrangements," he said. "I am only available for choices. Mine and yours, both." Adiz looked at him for a long moment. This ancient, careful, genuinely attempting man, and felt something she had thought Brennan's laughter had damaged beyond near-term repair quietly, stubbornly, announce its survival. Then let's start with honest, she said, and see where it goes. If someone showed you their most guarded wound and asked you to help them face it, what would you do? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. The morning meeting with the council was Adiz's idea. Silvano had not asked her to be present, had, in fact, assumed she would continue her assessment work while he managed the political situation with the private efficiency he applied to everything he considered his responsibility alone. She understood this about him now. The way he had spent centuries absorbing difficulty without distributing it. The way solitude had become his default position not from preference, but from the long habit of being the person everyone else deferred to, which was a specific and invisible kind of loneliness. She came to the main hall at 9 in the morning with her project documentation under her arm and sat down at the long table without asking permission, and the council looked at her with varying expressions of surprise and calculation, and Silvano looked at her with something that was almost relief. The conservationist, Peregrine said, with the particular intonation of someone using a word as a diminishment. The architectural conservationist, Adiz confirmed pleasantly, with a specific interest in the East Wing's restoration timeline, which has direct bearing on this morning's discussion. Peregrine looked at Silvano. This is irregular. Most things worth doing are, Silvano said. She had spent the previous evening not in the cottage but in Haromir's library, a long, high-ceilinged room that smelled of old paper and wood smoke, reading everything she could find about the blood-borne succession protocols that Wren, proving once again that she was the most practically useful person on the estate, had quietly made available. What she had found was illuminating in ways the council had apparently not anticipated anyone outside their community discovering. The succession arrangement they were presenting as politically necessary was, by the council's own founding charter, advisory rather than binding. The emperor's consent was not a formality, it was a constitutional requirement. The council had been, for the better part of a decade, gradually reframing advisory authority as binding obligation, and doing so with the confidence of people who assumed their emperor was too burdened by his private grief to read the small print. She presented this at the table with the same measured clarity she brought to her conservation assessments, not as an attack, not as a performance, but as evidence, documented, cross-referenced, and organized with the methodical attention of someone who understood that the most powerful thing you could bring into a room full of authority was accurate information, clearly expressed. The council was silent for a considerably longer time than was comfortable. Isadora Thorne, sitting at the table's end with the watchful attention she had maintained since arriving, made a sound that was almost certainly a suppressed laugh. The charter reference on page 47, Adiz said to Peregrine, sliding the relevant document across the table, is particularly useful. Peregrine looked at it, then at Silvano, then back at the document with the expression of someone recalculating several things simultaneously. The arrangement, Silvano said into the silence, is withdrawn. Isadora. He addressed her directly, with the courtesy he had extended from the beginning. I will speak with your family personally. You deserve a choice in this matter as much as I do. That conversation is long overdue, and I take responsibility for not having it sooner. Isadora looked at him for a moment. I would appreciate that, she said quietly. Genuinely. Peregrine made one final attempt. He waited until the formal meeting had concluded and the other council members were filing out, and he approached Adiz with the careful manner of someone who had revised their tactics and was deploying a more personal register. You are human, he said, stating it as though she might not be aware. Yes, she agreed. The Emperor's world is not a simple one to enter. There are complexities, dangers, expectations that would reshape your life in ways you cannot currently anticipate. Adiz considered him for a moment. There was, she thought, something almost genuine beneath the political maneuvering, some actual concern in the warning, however self-servingly delivered. Counselor Voss, she said, I am a woman who spent 9 years carefully loving someone who found her replaceable and laughed about it. I am not frightened of complexity. I am, if anything, more frightened of simplicity that turns out to be emptiness. Peregrine looked at her for a long moment. He has not, he said finally, with the careful delivery of someone surrendering a position, laughed at anything in 112 years. I know, she said. I've been paying attention. It happened in the entrance hall, where the light came through the tall windows and long cold columns, and the old stone floor held the morning quiet. Brennan arrived at 11. She had not told him where she was, had not needed to, apparently, because Brennan, when motivated, was capable of a resourcefulness he rarely bothered to deploy on her behalf. He stood in Harrowmere's entrance, looking simultaneously out of place and aggressively certain of himself, in the way of someone who had confused the courage required to show up with the right to be welcomed. He had not expected Silvano. Silvano had not expected Brennan either, had been crossing the entrance hall when the door opened, and now stood with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a situation and assessing it completely before responding. Brennan looked at him, at the white hair, the pale skin, the quality of presence that filled the hall without effort. Something uncertain moved through his expression. "At ease," he said, finding her behind Silvano's shoulder. "I came to. I think I made a mistake." "You did," she said. "Several. I want to." "Brennan." She said his name with the same quiet clarity she had used on the phone. "You laughed. I have thought about that every day since, and my conclusion has not changed. What you showed me in that kitchen was true. I'd rather have the truth than the revision." He looked at Silvano again. Something shifted in his face, the specific recalibration of a man understanding, too late, the difference between what he had and what he had discarded. "Who is he?" Brennan said. Silvano looked at Adiz. A question in his expression. "Do you want me to answer that, or would you prefer to?" And the consideration of it, the simple instinct to check rather than assume, was so different from everything she had navigated for 9 years that she felt it land somewhere foundational. "Someone who reads my work," she said, "and asks before assuming." Brennan left. And Silvano, the vampire emperor, for centuries old, who had outlasted kingdoms and sealed rooms against grief, and spent 6 years reading the papers of a conservationist who understood that damaged things were still worth preserving, looked at Adiz Whitmore in the entrance hall of Harrowmere with the morning light falling across them both. And he knelt, not performatively, not with theater or grandeur. One knee on the old stone floor, unhurried and deliberate, his eyes level with hers, and his expression carrying the specific gravity of someone making a choice they have considered from every angle and arrived at completely. "I am not doing this because you require it," he said. "I am doing this because I want you to know, clearly, without ambiguity, that I see you. Fully. Everything your husband looked at and found ordinary, I find extraordinary." Adiz looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand and said, "Get up, Silvano, and show me the rest of the library." He stood, and for the first time since she had arrived at Harrowmere, she saw him smile. Fully, without reservation, the smile of someone who had been away from warmth for a very long time and had just, improbably and genuinely, found their way back to it. If someone showed you their most guarded wound and asked you to help them face it, what would you do? We'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. The East Wing reopened on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Adiz had arrived at Harrowmere with 2 cases of equipment and the specific focused calm of someone choosing forward motion over paralysis. The boarding came down from Celia's window, and the morning light entered that room for the first time in 80 years. It came in gray and clean and entirely unhurried, the way valley light always did, and it moved across the pale walls and the cream upholstery and the writing desk with the particular quality of something returning to a place it had always belonged. Adiz stood in the doorway and watched it happen. Silvano stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of him completely, the specific gravity of his presence that she had grown accustomed to in the way you grow accustomed to things that are good for you, gradually and then entirely. He was looking at the light on the desk where Celia's green journal still sat, replaced there after he had read it fully for the first time in a century, and his expression held the particular quality of grief that has been genuinely processed, still present, still real, but no longer sealed against itself. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "You said that about your mother," Adiz replied. "In a different story. It is true in this one as well," he said. Celia was curious and honest, and she had no patience for people who looked at damaged things and saw only the damage. Adiz looked at the room, at the water stain she had documented and treated, at the repaired plaster above the window, at the careful work of restoration that had honored what the room was without pretending the 80 years had not happened. The damage is part of it, she said. That's what I always try to explain. You don't restore something by erasing what it survived. You restore it by making what it survived survivable. He looked at her with the complete attention she had stopped trying to deflect. Yes, he said simply. Exactly that. Audie arrived on the Saturday. Adiz had called her the previous week with the specific tone of voice that communicated there is significant information and I require your presence to process it properly. And Audie, who had never once failed to show up when that tone was deployed, had arranged a train and a weekend bag and arrived at Haromir's front door with the contained excitement of someone who had been given an outline and was very ready for the full picture. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at the old stone and the high ceilings and the quality of light through the tall windows, and then she looked at Adiz with an expression of frank delight. You're staying, she said. Not a question. I'm finishing the assessment, Adiz said. You're staying, Audie repeated, smiling now. The East Wing restoration will take several months of ongoing consultation, Adiz said. It would be impractical to manage remotely. Several months, Audie said, with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been thoroughly vindicated. Of ongoing consultation. Audie, I'm not saying anything. You're saying everything. I'm saying, Audie said, taking Adiz's arm and walking with her toward the library where Silvano had arranged tea with the specific thoughtfulness of someone learning, carefully and willingly, the domestic language of consideration, that you went to a castle to fix old stones and apparently also fix something much older and considerably more interesting, and I want every detail. Silvano met Audie in the library with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that this particular person's assessment mattered and was prepared to be evaluated honestly. Audie sat across from him with her tea and looked at him with the frank intelligence she applied to everything important and asked him 3 questions that Adiz had not thought to ask, and that he answered with the complete honesty she had come to understand was his only register when the subject was something he actually cared about. Afterward, when Silvano had excused himself to speak with Ren about the weekend arrangements, Audie turned to Adiz with an expression that had moved well past delight into something quieter and more serious. He looks at you, she said, the way people look at things they cannot believe they get to have. Adiz looked at her tea. Brennan called again, she said. Twice. And I have nothing to say that I haven't already said. Good, Audie said simply. That's exactly right. The formal separation from Brennan was handled with the clean efficiency of something that had actually ended long before its paperwork caught up with it. Adiz's solicitor, recommended by Philippa Voss, who had taken the news of the extended Haromir consultation with the understated satisfaction of someone whose instincts about meaningful projects had proved correct, handled the details with minimal drama. Brennan did not contest anything. She thought about him occasionally, with the measured compassion she tried to extend to most situations once she was sufficiently distant from them. Not warmly, not yet, but without the specific weight of someone still carrying something they had set down. He had been, for 9 years, a person she had loved genuinely. That was real and worth acknowledging. He had also been a person who had looked at everything she offered and found it insufficient, and had laughed, and those things were also real and equally worth acknowledging. She did not wish him specific harm. She wished him, with the sincere disinterest of someone who had moved on completely, whatever he was capable of becoming. On the last evening of Audie's visit, the 3 of them sat in the library after dinner, Adiz and Audie on the long sofa, Silvano in the chair across the fire, the room warm and lamplit, and carrying the comfortable ease of people who have found their configurations with each other. And Audie asked Silvano about the oldest thing he remembered. He considered the question with the genuine attention he gave everything. A coastline, he said finally, that no longer exists in the form I knew it. The land has changed. The water has changed. The people who live there are entirely gone. A pause. I used to find that devastating. The impermanence. Everything becoming something else. And now? Audie asked. He looked at Adiz. Now I think becoming something else is not the same as being lost, he said. Things change because they survive. Surviving requires change. I spent a long time confusing the two. Adiz thought about a room sealed for 80 years and a building that had absorbed 4 centuries of weather and history and was still standing, still worth preserving, still capable of letting in the morning light when someone finally took the boarding down. She thought about a woman who had been told she was replaceable and had driven to a valley and found, in the work she loved, and the unlikely person who had loved that work from a careful distance, something she had not known she was missing because she had never had a name for it. Being genuinely seen. Not managed. Not replaced. Not laughed at. Seen, completely, attentively, across a distance of 6 years and 4 centuries, and every damaged and surviving thing in between. She wrote Audie a message 3 weeks later, from the East Wing's restored room where she had set up a temporary desk beside Celia's old writing desk because the light in the mornings was, as Celia had apparently understood, extraordinary. The message was 4 words. You were right. Staying. Audie's response arrived in 30 seconds. Obviously. Send pictures. Both kinds. Adiz laughed, fully, without reservation, the laugh of someone who had returned to themselves from a considerable distance and found the return worthwhile. Outside the window, the valley was doing its patient, ordinary, extraordinary thing. The river at the eastern boundary. The woodland on 3 sides. The gray and gold light moving across old stones that had survived everything they had been asked to survive and were still, genuinely, worth preserving. Inside, somewhere in the library below, she could hear Silvano moving. The specific, unhurried quality of someone who had spent centuries alone in a space and was learning, willingly and with great care, what it meant to share it. She opened her notebook, wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and began. This story explored what it truly means to be seen, not performed for, not managed, but genuinely witnessed by someone paying honest attention. Adiz didn't find her worth through revenge or triumph. She found it by doing her work, telling the truth, and recognizing the difference between someone who laughs at your value and someone who has been quietly honoring it from a distance. What was your biggest takeaway from her journey? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you in any way, consider subscribing for more tales about people who find themselves in the most unexpected places.